Welcome to day 2 of TRAC. I am your host today. I am Evelyne Viegas, and I will be hosting the Trustworthy and Robust AI Collaboration Workshop, a virtual event. As a reminder, this is an opportunity for us to hear about the 10 collaborations that we have. Yesterday we heard about 5, and later in the day we'll hear about the next 5 collaborations. This is also an opportunity for us to think about new topics for this effort. Yesterday we heard during the breakout sessions about safe AI, about coping with bias, and later in the day we will hear today about interpretability, explainability, as well as adversarially robust AI. Finally, on the closing session, we'll have Daniela and Eric, who will join us to close the session. As a reminder, they are the co-director for TRAC, and we will also have Aleksander, who is the lead PI for this effort, who will also join us. But now is our beginning here with our first keynote for the day, and only keynote actually. We have Hal Dome, who will be talking about language technology's power. Hal actually has a dual hat. He's at Microsoft Research in New York City. He's a principal researcher. He's also an associate professor at the University of Maryland. A couple of questions he asks himself when he looks at the research he does today. He says, how can we get computers to learn language through natural interaction with people and users? And also, how can we do this in a way that is going to promote fairness, transparency, and explainability in the learned models? As a reminder, just before I leave Hal to tell us about language technology's power, as a reminder, you have a chat in the window there. If you have any questions during the talk, please post them there, and then Hal will answer them at the end of his talk. Hal, please go ahead.
Hi, so as Evelyne said, I'm Hal, so thanks for having me. I'm really pleased to be able to talk today, mostly about 2 papers that were published in ACL this year. So if you want more, you can go see them in a couple of weeks when that takes place. So one of them is with Sulin Blodgett, and she's a PhD student at University of Massachusetts. She was an intern at Microsoft Research last summer with me and Solon Barocas and Hannah Wallach. And then the other is with Trista Tsao, who's a PhD student at University of Maryland, who I work with my second hat on. I guess I want to start by sort of contrasting bias in AI systems broadly and machine learning systems in particular with how I see things in natural language processing. And, of course, because I think of myself as a natural language processing person, of course, I think that, natural language processing is magical and different from everything else. And there's 2 reasons for this. So, if you go to sort of the sociolinguistics literature, you'll see that language plays 2 roles in society, or at least 2 roles. So one is identity. So how do I construct my own identity and how do I display that to the world? And then the second is like the actual explicit construction of the social world. So this includes things like how are stereotypes passed on intergenerationally, how are social roles constructed, and so on. So to give sort of a personal example on identity, so this is sometimes referred to as second-order indexicality in language. So this is me around 2003. This is when I was an intern at Microsoft during the time that I was a PhD student. That was my cat Nuzzles when she was a kitten. And when I was there, within the first couple of weeks, I gave a talk in the NLP group. And about 10 minutes into the talk, Bob Moore, who was this senior researcher, raised his hand, and I called on him. And he asked me, "Hal, are you from Southern California?" And I said, "Yes, why?" And he explained that he had just heard a story on NPR that morning about the Southern California dialect and language usage and so on. So I don't know what he was cueing on. Maybe I say like more than other people or whatever, perhaps also like nasaled A's and so on. So there's various parts of my speech and language usage that conveys like some part of my identity. You also see this on Twitter. So this is an example from Brandeis Marshall. where we have a tweet from around the time of the 2016 Oscars in the linguistic subcommunity on Twitter, often referred to as Black Twitter, where one of the users says, "Damn, Chris Rock, you a savage," in that opening monologue, LOL. So here we see language usage as a way of signifying community membership in some linguistic community. So that's on the identity side. On the construction of the social world side, this was this was a slide or an example I made just for this talk. So this is from an article from the periodical The Advocate. And this is talking in other parts about this person, Maria Munir, who at the time of the Obama presidency, it says, Z was terrified of the reaction that might ensue, but foreseeing herself forward, etc. So this is a case of a person who identifies as non-binary, uses pronouns like Z and here, and yet Microsoft Word, for instance, although Google Docs is no different, does not accept this as proper English. And so this is sort of a small way, but this is a way in which, like, the technology that we build enforces, in some sense, some notion of what language and therefore what social categories are acceptable in the world. So there's been a lot of work looking at bias in NLP. So I'll talk briefly about this survey that we did of about 150 papers that came out just over the past few years. And this work's been really critical in demonstrating that NLP systems that we develop run serious risks of exhibiting gender, racial, and all sorts of other societal biases. But at the same time, there's a struggle in this work to figure out actually what bias means. And so this work often treats certain observations of model behavior or dataset distributions as self-evident instances of bias without digging into that more deeply. And so by nature of studying the social implications of NLP systems, we really have to be careful and precise about what we mean by bias, what behaviors are harmful, in what ways, and for whom. So digging into this a little bit more, and without diminishing the tremendous amount of important work on bias that's emerged in this field, we took an opportunity to take stock of where the field was. So this is this ACL paper with Sue Lin, in which we surveyed 146 papers on bias, focusing on text, so not on speech. There's lots of interesting work on speech as well. And the first thing we did is categorize papers' stated motivations and then the proposed techniques in each paper. And one of the sort of major findings here is that there's often a lack of clear and consistent conceptualizations of bias. Based on this, at the end of this talk, I'll talk a bit about a proposed path forward to dealing with some of the issues that came up. So to give a sense of where the field stands right now, I should say right now means as of May 2020, which is when we stopped doing the surveying. About a third of the papers that had been published on NLP focus on word embedding. So basically low dimensional representations of the meanings of words. There were also about 20 papers on coreference resolution and then many on other tasks. So beyond the task, we also looked at the type of bias or harm that was being studied in this paper. So this was according to our own taxonomy, where we distinguish between allocational harms. So this is harms where decision-making systems allocate resources or opportunities, for instance, credit or hiring, and representational harms, which are much more like the ones that I spoke about at the beginning, where systems represent some social groups in a less favorable light than others, demean them, or fail to recognize their existence altogether. So stereotyping is one such representational harm, but certainly not the only one. In addition to that, we identify papers that motivate or quantify according to more general correlations between system behaviors and features of language that are typically associated with particular social groups, as well as papers that leave unstated their motivations altogether. So this was looking at motivations in papers. We also looked at proposed techniques, finding some correlation between the techniques proposed in papers and the type of harm that motivates that work, but also many mismatches. So we have some exact quotes from papers in the ACL paper. These are not quotes, but these are sort of emblematic statements that you might see as examples of paper motivations that may be vague or imprecise. So in the first one, we have something like biased embeddings can perpetuate systemic biases in society, discriminate against different groups of users, and promote social injustice. The second one, biased outputs or discriminatory behaviors might offend users or result in negative user experiences. And biased algorithms risk taking problematic actions, affecting important downstream applications such as hiring. So we can see in the type of language presented here that although these papers acknowledge the harms that NLP systems can give rise to, they're often imprecise about what they mean. So phrases like systemic biases, discrimination against different groups, social injustice, problematic actions, and so forth often leave unstated what they mean or how the system behavior under consideration specifically contributes to them. And even language describing offending users or negative user experiences in hiring, though a little bit more concrete, don't really tell us what these outcomes look like, how the NLP systems in question give rise to these outcomes, or who the relevant users or stakeholders might be. In addition, identifying bias is an inherently normative process in which some system behaviors are deemed right and other system behaviors are deemed wrong. This process necessarily is underpinned by researchers' social values, but motivations on research for bias are sometimes provided without articulating the normative reasoning or the social values that led to the identification of bias in the first place. And this makes things really difficult as a field because these decisions are normative. If we're not explicit about the normative reasoning, it becomes very difficult to debate whether particular issues or harms are sort of more or less important as a work of focus. So for instance, here are two examples of motivating language that we might see in papers. So one is models should not rely on demographic attributes expressed in the text to make predictions. And the second is models that rely on demographic attributes in the text yield higher error rates. So the first quote here is an example of a motivation that doesn't provide any normative reasoning, that does provide normative reasoning, namely that models should not use demographic information as a matter of principle, while the second motivates its research question on bias by an observation about predictive performance. By going through these 150 or so papers, we also observed that many papers for the same task often conceptualize bias differently. So for instance, some papers about gender or racial bias examine performance differences between text written about different groups, whereas others examine difference in text written by people who are members of different groups. And these can get very intertwined when people report on their lived experiences. So one of the things that we found when looking at hate speech detection and toxicity detection is that, for instance, on the Reddit subforum genderqueer, where many gender nonconforming or gender questioning people go to discuss issues that they've faced in life, a user might describe some hate bias that they experienced or some terrible lived experience like getting kicked out of their house by their parents. So this is language by someone, but describing language about them. And these very frequently get flagged as hate speech because of the aboutness property. So these differences are obscured by the use of the terminology bias across papers, making it difficult to recognize when papers may not be quantifying the same phenomenon. And then similarly, although word embedding papers are motivated by a diverse range of ideas of what constitutes bias or why bias is harmful, including hiring and resume filtering, stereotyping, under recognition of women in society, most actually just quantify one of those types of harms, which is stereotyping. And finally, we find that the motivations and techniques may not often be well matched. So many papers are rightly concerned about possible allocational harms, for instance, the hiring or resume filtering example, but these are rarely measured. And so this gives a big opportunity to examine what allocational harms NLP systems give rise to, by what mechanisms, and who thus is harmed. So the last thing I want to highlight here is that a lot of this work focuses on a very narrow range of bias sources. So this is typically sources in either data sets or in model training. And many other aspects of the NLP or machine learning lifecycle are left unconsidered. So Jen Wortman-Vaughan and Hannah Wallach had this wonderful webinar about a year ago where they looked at the machine learning lifecycle. The NLP lifecycle is basically the same. The only change from what they presented is I separated collecting data and annotating data into 2 steps. But roughly, most NLP systems go through some form of this pipeline, although generally not perfectly linearly, where you define a task, you collect some data, you annotate it, you define a model, train a model, test the model, deploy it, and then get feedback, and then use this to improve how you define your task. So I want to give a specific example of this in the context of coreference resolution, which is the task of determining which references in text refer to the same real-world entity. So here we have a sentence like the nurse and the doctor visited her mother, and the coreference question around her is to determine whether this refers to the nurse, to the doctor, or to neither. In many cases, if you ask annotators to annotate this first example, because of social biases, they may prefer to annotate her as coreferent with the nurse rather than the doctor. And we see this in previous papers like those by Rachel Rudinger that look at binary gender bias in coreference resolution. There's a second effect that happens when you start looking at cases where a gender neutral pronoun like er is used here, which essentially masks the social gender that annotators may rely on. And so one of the things that we see in a lot of work on gender bias systems is that there's this conflation of sociological gender concepts into a single thing called gender with linguistic concepts of gender, which are correlated but not exactly the same. So in order to talk about this in a little bit more detail, we have to dig a bit more into gender. So I'll put a big caveat here that gender itself is a hotly contested construct. And so I'm not going to be able to do a good job of representing all the various gender theories there are. But one thing that I think is reasonably clear is that there's this folk notion of gender, which was highlighted in the context of gender recognition on images by Os Keys a couple of years ago at CHI, that marks gender as a construct that's binary, so male, female, immutable, so assigned at birth, and imperfect correspondence to gender linguistic form. So Os didn't look at the linguistic aspect, he looked at visual aspects, but this would be the parallel in a language setting. So if you look at around 150 ACL papers, this happens to be a different 150 papers, so this is ones not on bias, but ones on gender. Upwards of 90% of them essentially make use of this folk notion of gender, either implicitly or explicitly. The problem, of course, is that none of these things are true. So there are plenty of people who do not fall on the male-female binary of gender. Gender can change, for instance, in the case of gender fluid people, it changes by time or context. And there's simply no one-to-one mapping between one's gender in the world and how linguistic forms refer to that person. So sociological gender and linguistic gender are the two terms that we'll use. Lauren Ackerman has a nice paper that breaks this down somewhat differently, but at a high level, the ideas are basically the same. So sociological gender covers my own experience of my gender, as well as my expression of my gender to the world, as well as social gender, which is essentially the normative conditions that society imposes on us. So this is things like the fact that we may have been socialized to believe that long hair is correlated with women and stoicism is correlated with men. On the other side, we have linguistic gender. So in languages that are not English, we have things like grammatical gender. In pretty much every language, we have some notion of referential gender. So this is the case where I use some linguistic form to refer to a non-linguistic entity. So this can be realized in pronouns, gendered pronouns in English, but it can also be used anytime we have a gendered form that refers to some person in the world. And then finally, there's lexical gender. So lexical gender are words that, even when they're not referring to a specific person, carry gender information. So if I say something like, every mother loves their children, mother is not referring to a specific person, but it still carries lexical gender. Okay, so with that sort of background, I want to walk through a little bit of this life cycle. We talked about task definition already, at least a little bit, in terms of the fact that most of NLP literature is sort of steeped in this folk notion of binary gender. In terms of data collection, we discussed this more in the paper, but briefly, when we as researchers make decisions about what data to use, we're making decisions about what constructs are important. So for instance, newspapers like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times have only recently started allowing in their style guides the use of gender neutral pronouns like singular they and neopronouns like ze here. And so when we select these sources as sources of our data, we're implicitly making decisions about what linguistic identities are being erased. In terms of data annotation, one of the things that we wanted to look at was how annotator positionality may impact the type of annotations that are made and therefore the types of models that are learned. So the way that we did this was we constructed this counterfactual data set where we took a paragraph from Wikipedia, and then we took the different notions of linguistic gender and systematically removed them. So this would be the original text. We can also remove gender information from pronouns by using gender neutral variants. We can remove gender cues from names by replacing them with an initial and last name. And we can remove gender information from lexical gender by replacing gendered words with non-gendered variants. And then finally, terms of address can generally just be removed altogether. So we can do this all automatically, and then for each variant that we're interested in, we can have crowd workers annotate the coreference decisions to see what sort of social gender stereotypes they're using in annotation. So here, the y-axis represents the accuracy against a gold standard. So this is not at 100% because crowdsourced data always has some noise in it. So in the leftmost column, we have the annotations on the original. So this is how much do they agree with the gold standard. And then on the far right, we have the case when the pronouns are all ablated to gender neutral variants. And so what we see is that there's a large and significant drop in performance, which is basically due to all gender inferences that are made based on social gender. So annotators can still accurately make annotation decisions on the basis of syntactic structure and other cues, but the gender information plays a substantial role in their annotation behavior. And a lot of this comes just from the name. So annotators seem to be using name as quite a strong cue in making decisions. So there's a lot more to say about this, but the short version is there certainly is evidence that annotator positionality has an impact on the data that they create. So I'm going to skip over defining models and training models because training models is what 99% of research on bias in machine learning looks at, and then just talk briefly about testing. So one of the downsides to the data set that we created by ablation is that the text is somewhat unnatural. And so you could be worried that an author might not actually write these sort of counterfactual statements. So instead, we took naturally occurring data that includes many references to people with non-binary gender identities and who use either singular they or neopronouns. So most of these are from LGBTQ periodicals and then fan fiction stories from Archive of Our Own. So here's an example of an annotated story from Archive of Our Own. So in this case, the character Krona uses the pronouns they, their, and Sol, although you don't see it here, I believe uses a set of neopronouns, but I'm not positive. So you can look at how well various systems do on this data. And so we evaluated 5 off-the-shelf coreference systems. This one is one from AI2. It achieves an F score of about 35%. This is actually not any better or worse than any of the other systems. They all have about the same performance overall. In comparison, on more quote-unquote standard data sets, the best performing system achieves about 60% F1. And they do have slightly different performance. In general, they have higher precision than recall, often because their recall for detecting neopronouns at all is significantly lower. So in particular, on average, they only even annotate 13% of neopronouns as pronouns. Okay, so there sort of remains the deploy and collect feedback, which we didn't do anything about, but presumably there are interesting things to look at there also. So in the last minute or two, I want to give a bit of a sense of where we see things going forward. So the first is that language is situated in the world, and the world has social hierarchies. And so when we say social hierarchies, we refer to those that result from unjust distributions of economic resources and political power. And this relationship between language and social hierarchies has been studied for decades in fields like sociolinguistics, linguistic anthropology, sociology, social psychology, and particularly the feminist and critical race perspectives in those subdisciplines. And so engaging with this literature, I think, is an important step to making progress. So echoing Ruha Benjamin, who asked how race and technology are co-produced, we therefore urge research on bias to reorient around this question: how do existing social hierarchies and language ideologies drive the development of NLP systems, and how do NLP systems reproduce them? The next would be to start getting more concrete when we talk about bias. So as we've said, analyzing bias is an inherently normative process, and so we should be explicit about our normative reasoning. And we should endeavor to ensure that the conceptualizations of bias that we use to motivate our work are matched with the quantitative techniques that we propose. And then last, I think it's important to examine language use in practice. So language use is necessarily situated, but if we recognize the reality of social hierarchies in the world, then we have to also recognize that groups within different social positions have different experiences. And so this means that we really need to center the work on the lived experience of members of the community affected by the NLP systems that we develop, and in particular interrogate the power relationships between technologists, which I think is mostly us, and the affected communities. Just to be clear, technologists and affected communities don't have to be different sets. So there's plenty of people who are technologists and are also negatively impacted by the technology that's built. So just to wrap up, so we looked at a bunch of different harms that can arise in NLP systems, and I think that this expands upon a lot of the common machine learning settings. There tends to be this lack of clear conceptualization of bias, which I think at some point, perhaps now, is going to hold back the field rather significantly. And so our recommendations are to consider the entire development lifecycle, to reorient around social hierarchy conceptualizations, to articulate conceptualizations of bias, and to examine language use in practice by centering communities. So with that, I will stop and take any questions.
Thank you, Hal, for a very interesting and exciting talk, and really amazing how we use language and develop those NLP systems. I'm going to invite again the people who are on the call to please post any questions that you have for Hal in the chat window. In the meantime, just to get the conversation going and letting people think about questions, when I looked your paper, your ACL paper, and all those recommendations, I was struck by the fact that some of those recommendations, it seemed to me that could potentially apply not just to NLP systems, but more broadly to AI systems, like computer vision, specifically your last two recommendations. Are you thinking of doing some work in that direction with some other colleagues? Or how general your recommendations may be? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting point. I actually haven't thought about it too much, largely because I'm, barely an expert in, sociolinguistics. I don't want to sort of stray out of my lane too much. I think that there is a lot of potential overlap. So certainly this last point about like centering communities. So I think we're seeing a lot more of this in AI in general. So like Batya Friedman has this really nice work on diverse voices methodology, which is a way of centering communities affected by technology and policy decisions around that technology. So they've looked at, or they've done panels, for instance, with people who are formerly incarcerated and how their lives are impacted by facial recognition technology and virtual reality and so on. So we're like highly inspired by a lot of that work also in thinking about the centering of communities. In terms of what's the third bullet on the point, which is sort of the conceptualizations of bias, I think I'm just not sufficiently familiar with the like computer vision or other applied areas to have a strong sense there, but I think it would be interesting to think of there, and also particularly in settings like healthcare, where we know that there are sort of historical biases that operate very differently than in language. So I think it would be awesome to try to expand this and think about those other spaces. But yeah, beyond what I pointed to with the Batya Friedman, I don't know anything in particular.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, I think we have a new question. So there is a question coming from our participants. So actually, let me just publish it so that people can see too. So here's the question for you, Hal. First of all, thanks for sharing. And among the work that you reviewed, are there any studies that quantify common biases that hold across different languages and cultures?
Yeah, that's a great question. And perhaps I should have highlighted this, right? So like the rest of NLP, bias in NLP does focus on English and typically US English. Or at least sort of like how these things are sort of like the social structures that exist in the US. There is work looking at other languages. So particularly if you want to look at issues of grammatical gender, which I think it's generally considered English doesn't have. You can quibble about whether gendered pronouns are an example of grammatical gender or not, but I think the general consensus is no. So there has been work that looks at issues of grammatical gender cross-linguistically, typically Indo-European languages, because after English, that's what the NLP community tends to look at. So There's been a bit there. I think probably the most common things that you see are things around translation. So there's been a bunch of studies like out of University of Washington where they look at, if you have a language that doesn't mark gender and you translate a sentence from that language into a language that does mark gender, and the system has to essentially invent the gender from whole cloth, it typically does so along gender stereotyped lines. In terms of other social categories other than gender, for instance, like race, I can't think off the top of my head, right? So the way that the US divides up race is different than the way the rest of the world divides up race. Although we do export a lot of our racial constructs to the rest of the world through media and things like that, I can't think of cases where people have looked specifically at like race ethnicity issues in a sort of non-US frame. There definitely is work on this in like in sociolinguistics land. So there's this great book called Language and Ethnicity, which spends about the first 50 pages trying to define what ethnicity is so that they can talk about it in a global context. But I haven't seen much work looking at this from a computational perspective.
Thank you. We are getting many questions here. Another question for you, Hal, from Kathy, who says, I'm curious if you think there will ultimately be a single correct definition for gender and related concepts for NLP, or whether it will depend on the applications and use.
Yeah, so I guess no. I think that sort of like any other social construct, like how we think of gender is certainly going to vary by time, right? So like, for instance, the easy example is not a language example, but the easy example is, we have this, many people, at least in the US, are socialized to associate, pink with girls and blue with boys. But, 200 years ago, it was like the reverse. And so, these things change, like how we think about like the different issues of socialization. Like I think all of this is like, as society continues to change, like the way that we conceptualize these things and systems have to change. I do think that on the second part, I do think it's super important to think about these things in a like grounded in specific applications. I think it's very difficult to think about what, like, for instance, a lot of work on bias and embeddings, I think is really difficult to think about because, embeddings can be used for anything. And so it's very unclear, like, if there's some correlation in the representation that I've learned, like what does that actually mean in terms of downstream harms on individuals or groups? So I think maybe at some point we might get to a point where we can think about it more broadly, but right now, at least for me, I find it very helpful to just pick an application and think about that deeply and then, move on to the next one. But that, of course, has limitations too.
Mm-hmm. And now the last question we'll take this morning for you. Hal, in your ablation study, do you think it's possible that the modifications to all gender-related terms could have changed the structure of the sentence in a way that is not related to gender? So, for instance, when you just modify a person's name, the change seems more controlled somehow, but the changes you mentioned in your talk are a bit more extensive.
Yeah, so I could talk about this for a long time. I think that, which is a large part of the reason why we collected the naturally occurring data, because we were concerned about things exactly like this. I think the major things that I have concerns about there are that for some terms, the distinction between a term having lexical gender or not is very person and dialect specific. So for instance, so on the lexical items, like actor, actress. So, you know, in most varieties of English that accept actress, that would be seen as female. But actor is sort of less clear, right? So like it could specifically mean male, or it could be sort of the gender neutral form. And so this is not the case with like sister, brother, sibling. So sibling doesn't carry this sort of like historical baggage that actor does. So I don't think there's major issues with sort of effects on grammaticality, but I think that it's virtually impossible to actually remove all social gender. So for instance, in the example that I showed, it said so-and-so, 36th president of the United States, right? Like, okay, that role doesn't have to be a man, but historically it has been. And so, you know, to sort of try to remove everything would be virtually impossible, which is why we went for the removing the gender from the pronoun, because then any gender that exists elsewhere is not going to be useful. So I don't think there's a grammaticality issue, but I do think that things are much more complicated than, you know, the one slide that I had to show about it.
All right. Well, thank you again for your great talk, Hal. Thank you to all the participants. So we now moving into a break, and we'll meet you on Teams. Jen will send the link for us to go and listen to the lightning talks. See you in 5 minutes. Thank you all.